What if the secret to becoming a billionaire isn't an elite degree, but your willingness to read the manuals everyone else is too lazy to open? Welcome back to the deep end. Today, we are going to deconstruct the operating system of one of the most visible, yet perhaps misunderstood, minds in modern capitalism. We are talking about Mark Cuban. Now I know what you're thinking. You're picturing the guy on Shark Tank, the billionaire owner of the Dallas Mavericks, the guy arguing with referees courtside. But we aren't here to talk about the billionaire. We are here to talk about the broke 20-something who was sleeping on the floor of a 3-bedroom apartment in Dallas, eating happy hour tacos because they were free, and driving a car with a literal hole in the floorboard. We are diving into his manifesto, How to Win at the Sport of Business. And I call it a manifesto because book feels too passive for what this is. This is a collection of war stories and strategic doctrines from the front lines of extreme hustle. We are going to break down the first half of this text, covering the learning to win phase, the specific tactical lessons he stripped from Bill Gates and Michael Dell, and the rigid mental frameworks that allowed him to turn a series of humiliating failures into a net worth with 9 zeros. So, let's set the scene. The year is the early 1980s. The location is Dallas, Texas. Mark Cuban has just arrived in a 1977 Fiat X1/9. It's burning a quart of oil every week, and there is a hole in the floorboard, not a rust spot, a hole, where he can see the road rushing beneath him. He has no money. He has no connections. He has no specific skills that the market is clamoring for. This brings us to the first major pillar of Cuban's philosophy, the paid-to-learn mindset. In a world that constantly tells us we need more credentials, more degrees, and more letters after our names, Cuban takes a sledgehammer to the concept of the MBA. His argument is visceral. He looks at a job, any job, even the menial ones, not as a transaction of labor for money, but as a transaction of labor for data. He calls this getting paid to learn. Think about the inversion of logic here. Most people look at a low-paying job and think, I am wasting my time. Cuban looks at that same job and thinks, I am getting a front-row seat to how a business actually functions, and they are writing me the check. When he graduated from Indiana University, he didn't go to grad school. He went to Mellon Bank in Pittsburgh. He hated the corporate politics. He hated the middle management stagnation. But he didn't check out. He realized that even a bad job is a masterclass in what not to do. It is essentially negative data, which is just as valuable as positive data. He eventually lands in Dallas, living with 5 other guys in a 3-bedroom apartment in a place called The Village. This is where the legend of the $20 rule comes in. This is a profound lesson in resource allocation for young people. Cuban and his roommates had a rule. They would go out to party, but they would leave their credit cards at home. They would only bring $20 cash. That was the cap. If they blew it all in the first hour, the night was over. They were drinking cheap, $12 champagne to look high class, while eating the free buffet food at happy hours. Why does this matter? Because it established a baseline of low overhead. This is a concept Cuban returns to again and again. If you can live on nothing, if your cost of living is essentially zero, you remove the cost of failure. Most people cannot take risks because they have a mortgage, a car note, and an image to maintain. Cuban had none of that. He realized that if he tried to start a business and it failed, his life wouldn't change. He was already sleeping on the floor. He was already eating free tacos. You cannot fall off the floor. This creates a psychological asymmetry where you have infinite upside and capped downside. Now let's move to the tactical weapon that Cuban utilized to separate himself from the herd. He calls it RTFM. Read the frickin' manual. This sounds boring, right? It sounds like homework. But Cuban frames this as the ultimate competitive advantage. He lands a job at a company called Your Business Software. He knows nothing about software. He lands the job by wearing a polyester suit he got 2 for $99 and telling the owner, "If I don't know the answer, I will look it up." And he meant it. He discovered something about human nature that is as true today as it was in 1982. People are lazy. Most people will not do the work that is right in front of them. Cuban realized that the software manuals, the dense, technical documentation for programs like Peachtree and WordStar, were available to everyone. But nobody read them. Not the customers, and certainly not his competitors. So, every night, while his roommates were out or sleeping, Cuban was reading the manuals. He was memorizing the keystrokes. He was understanding the bugs. He realized that you don't need to be a genius to be an expert. You just need to process information that others ignore. By simply reading the documentation, he became the smartest guy in the room. He could walk into a client meeting and solve problems that baffled people with 10 years of experience, simply because he had done the reading. This is the information advantage. In the sport of business, the person with the most information usually wins, and information is often hiding in plain sight, disguised as work. But as with any good hero's journey, there has to be a crisis. A moment of severance. Cuban is killing it at this software store. He's bringing in new business. He's becoming a consultant. And then, he gets a lead. A client wants to buy $15,000 worth of software. In the early 80s, that is a massive deal. The only catch is, the client needs him to pick up the check now. But Cuban's boss, a man named Michael Humecki, has given him a direct order to stay at the store and open the doors, basically. To sweep the floors and unlock the gate. Cuban makes a choice. He chooses the revenue over the rules. He drives to the client, picks up the check for $15,000, and drives back to the store, thinking he's going to be a hero. He walks in, waves the check, and his boss looks at him and says, "You're fired. Fired. For making money." This moment is the fulcrum of his entire life. He walks out of that store stunned. But because he had that low overhead, because he had that dirt cheap lifestyle, he wasn't destroyed. He realized two things simultaneously. First, he was a terrible employee. He was unmanageable because he cared more about the result than the hierarchy. Second, he realized he never wanted to be in a position where someone else could dictate his future again. So, he goes to Galveston, gets drunk with his friends, and decides to start his own company, Micro Solutions. Now listen to the setup here, because this destroys the myth that you need venture capital to start a business. Cuban had zero capital. He had a car with a hole in the floor. He didn't even have a computer. What he had was sweat equity and relationships. He went back to the customers he had cultivated at his old job and made them a proposition. He said, "I can't finance the software for you. But if you front the money, I will install it, support it, and make it work. And if you don't like it, I'll give you the money back." He was operating on the float. He got a $500 advance from a client, used that $500 to buy the software from the distributor, kept the difference, and performed the labor himself. He built a multi-million-dollar company out of thin air, fueled entirely by the margin between his hustle and the customer's need. This leads us into the second major phase of the book, business as the ultimate sport. Cuban is a basketball fanatic, right? We know this. But he argues that business is infinitely more competitive, more grueling, and more rewarding than any professional sport. In basketball, there is a season. There are timeouts. There is an off-season. There are referees to ensure fairness. In business, it is 24/7/365/forever. There are no referees. There is no clock. And most importantly, you don't know who your opponent is. At least on the court, you can see the guy guarding you. In business, your competitor could be a kid in a garage in Estonia writing code that will make your entire industry obsolete in 6 months. Cuban writes about the lunch philosophy. He says, There is someone out there who is trying to take it all away from you. They are trying to steal your lunch. This creates a level of paranoia that drives him. He talks about the concept of the edge. What is the edge? It's the willingness to immerse yourself so deeply in your craft that you lose track of time. He describes working 24 hours straight and feeling like it was 20 minutes. That is the flow state of a true competitor. During this time, Cuban wasn't just working, he was watching the giants. This is the 1980s, so the giants are Bill Gates and Michael Dell. Cuban provides a fascinating analysis of what he learned from them, and it wasn't about technology. It was about psychology and pricing. He watched Michael Dell, who was running a company called PCs Limited at the time. Cuban noticed that every week in PC Week magazine, Dell would take out a full-page ad, and the prices of his computers would drop. Every single week. A 20-megabyte drive was $2,000 one week, then $1,950, then $1,900. Cuban realized Dell was doing something revolutionary. He was passing the decreasing cost of technology directly to the consumer in real time to buy market share. He was using price as a weapon to bludgeon competitors who were too slow to update their catalogs. Then he watched Bill Gates. He tells this great story about seeing Gates at a trade show in Las Vegas, back when Microsoft was just gaining steam. But the lesson wasn't about Gates's charisma. It was about his ruthlessness. Cuban watched Microsoft destroy competitors like Lotus and WordPerfect not by having a better product, but by changing the rules of the game. Microsoft introduced the bundle. They took Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, packaged them together, and sold them for $99. Competitors were selling single programs for $500. Microsoft sold the whole suite for $99. It wasn't just a sale, it was an extinction event. Cuban learned that you have to be willing to cannibalize your own revenue streams or destroy the industry standard if it means securing long-term dominance. You have to think like a giant, even when you are small. But let's strip away the strategy for a second and go back to the personal. Because even with all this hustle, life hits you. At age 27, Cuban is grinding. He has saved up $7,500. That's his life savings. He decides to propose to his girlfriend. He spends the entire $7,500 on a ring. He gives it to her. She loses it. And it wasn't insured. Let that sink in. He is back to zero. The relationship falls apart. He is 27, broke again, single, and living in a dump. It would be so easy to quit. To say, well, I tried. But this brings us to one of the most empowering concepts in the book. Effort is the only variable you control. Cuban argues that in a world of chaos, where girlfriends lose rings, where stock markets crash, where clients fire you, the only thing that belongs to you is your effort. You cannot control the outcome, but you can control the input. He stopped measuring his work in hours and started measuring it in goals. It wasn't about, I worked 12 hours today. It was about, did I learn the new software update? Did I close the deal? He pairs this with what I think is the most comforting idea for any entrepreneur, the one-win theory. He compares business to baseball. In baseball, if you fail 70% of the time, if you hit 300, you are a Hall of Famer. But in business, the math is even more forgiving. You can strike out 1,000 times. Cuban lists his failures. He tried to sell powdered milk, disaster. He opened a pub called Motley's that got shut down because an underage girl won a wet t-shirt contest, total disaster. He got fired from his software job. He was a walking resume of failure. But he says, it doesn't matter. You only have to be right once. When you hit that one home run, which for him was Micro Solutions, and later broadcast. Nobody remembers the powdered milk. Nobody remembers the wet t-shirt contest. The market forgives all your failures the moment you have one massive success. This redefines risk. If failure is temporary and anonymity is the worst-case scenario, but success is permanent and life-changing, then the rational move is to keep swinging the bat. Now, as we move into the later chapters of this section, Cuban shifts from the scrappy startup phase to the managing success phase. And this is where the advice becomes counterintuitive. He warns us about the bull market genius. Asterisk asterisk. He writes, everyone is a genius in a bull market. When the economy is ripping, when tech is booming, everyone is making money. It is easy to confuse a rising tide with your own ability to swim. Cuban is terrified of this. He constantly questions himself. Am I smart, or am I just lucky to be here right now? He uses the example of the sports broadcasting rights explosion. TV networks were paying billions for NBA games. Cuban looked at this and realized it wasn't because team owners were geniuses. It was because technology had shifted. Cable, satellite, and the internet created a desperate need for live content. He knew that the only way to survive when the tide went out was to focus on the customer experience, not just cash the checks. This leads to his marketing philosophy with the Dallas Mavericks. When he bought the team, they were the worst franchise in professional sports. Nobody went to the games. The arena was a mausoleum. What did he do? He didn't focus on selling the expensive VIP suites to corporations. He focused on the $2 tickets. Yes, $2. Why? Because he understood the lifetime value of a fan. He knew that a kid who comes to a game for $2 and has an amazing experience, sees the lights, hears the music, feels the energy, that kid is a fan for life. That kid will eventually buy a jersey. That kid will eventually buy a $50 ticket. That kid might eventually buy a suite. He argues that you have to democratize your product. You have to get people in the door. He famously said, "We are not in the basketball business. We are in the business of creating fun." He wasn't selling a win or a loss. He was selling an emotional experience that cost less than a movie ticket. But as he stabilized the Mavericks and his other businesses, he noticed a trap that successful entrepreneurs fall into. He calls it the second battle. Asterisk asterisk. Here is the scenario. You build a successful company. You are winning. You are dominating your niche. Then you get bored. Or you get greedy. You decide, hey, I should expand to China. I should launch a completely different product line. Cuban screams, stop. His rule is, win the battle you are in before you start a new one. He critiques the NBA heavily for this. He argued that the league was so obsessed with expanding into Europe and Asia that they were neglecting the domestic product. They were fighting a war on two fronts, and as any historian will tell you, that is a recipe for disaster. He applied this to his own company, HDNet. People kept telling him to take it global. He refused. He said, every minute I spend in a meeting about international distribution is a minute I am not spending making my US network the best in the world. This is a lesson in focus. It is the discipline of subtraction. It is easy to add complexity. It is hard to maintain intensity on the fundamentals. Cuban compares it to a basketball player practicing trick shots from half-court before they have mastered the free throw. You have to own your home court before you try to conquer the world. So, how do we synthesize all of this? What is the through line of Mark Cuban's early career? It starts with humility, the willingness to be the bad employee, the willingness to live on the floor, the willingness to admit you know nothing and need to read the manual. It transitions into intensity, the realization that business is a sport played 24/7, where someone is always trying to steal your lunch. It relies on resilience, the understanding that the engagement ring might get lost, the powdered milk business might fail. But you only need to be right once. And finally, it requires discipline, the ability to ignore the hype of a bull market, to reject the distraction of expansion, and to focus entirely on the battle right in front of you. Cuban's story is not about being the smartest guy in the world. He admits he wasn't. It's not about being the most talented. It's about being the most prepared. It's about the person who stays up late reading the manual, while everyone else is at the bar. It's about the person who realizes that, no, is just a word used by people who are too lazy to find a solution. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about your own manual. What is the documentation in your industry that nobody is reading? What is the happy hour food you should be eating so you can lower your overhead and take a risk? What is the one win you are chasing? Business is a sport. The season never ends. The scoreboard is always on. And as Mark Cuban would say, it's time to get off the sidelines and get in the game. Go out there, read the frickin' manual, and win.